Apology for Poetry. Scope: in this lecture, we shall explore Sidney's great defense of the divine origin and social utility of poetry. An Apology for Poetry, 1595. We shall discuss first how he praises poetry for being the cradle of civilization, for being a channel of divine power, for teaching and delighting, and for combining and surpassing the virtues of history and philosophy. We shall then move on to show how Sidney refutes the main arguments made against poetry, namely, that it is unprofitable, that it is full of lies, that it entices to sin, and that it was banished by Plato from his Republic. Outline: A few words about Sidney, his age, and his essay. A. Sidney was not only a great poet and critic but a man of the world. A. He lived during the Elizabethan age, the English Renaissance, and was a contemporary of Shakespeare. Though he was both a soldier and a courtier to Queen Elizabeth. B. Sidney saw it as his task to revive the sinking reputation of poetry. A. Like all the critics before him, he knew he would have to answer not only contemporary attacks on poetry but the attack by Plato. Though his apology is more synthetic than original, it pulls together ideas from Aristotle, Horace, Longinus, and a score of other theorists. 10. Sidney is very much a Christian critic. His defense of the moral nature of poetry must answer both Platonic philosophy and biblical theology. Though Sidney's arguments in defense of poetry. A. Poetry is the great light giver, the cradle of civilization. A. The first lawgivers, philosophers, and historians were all poets. Though Plato was himself the greatest of poets, his fanciful dialogues and beautiful allegories are the skin of his philosophy. 10. Poetry, like a passport, prepares the mind to receive learning. 4. Men who attack poetry are like sons who rise up against their fathers, cf. The anxiety of influence discussed earlier. B. The power and craft of poetry are of the same essence as the divine. A. In antiquity, poets were says and verse, the language of prophecy. Though it is through poetry that David, in the Psalms, was able to express and embody the majesty and beauty of God. Saint Paul, likewise, switches to poetry when he is extolling God's glory. 10. The poet, like God, is a maker, whereas all other arts, from geometry to music to science, take their cues and their foundations from nature. The poet alone transcends and even improves upon the natural world. 4. That is to say, the mimesis of the poet is a higher kind of imitation. It transforms beasts into cyclopes, men into heroes, bronze into gold. 5. Indeed, what the poet finally imitates is not nature herself but a more perfect idea in the mind to which the poet gives a shape or form. Sidney borrowed this concept from a Neoplatonic philosopher named Plotinus, who combined the mimetic theories of Plato and Aristotle. C. The end of poetry is to teach and please, hence, it is useful to society. A. The imitations of poetry are able to delight and teach, for they do not merely copy virtues and vices as they are, but as they should be. Though poetry inspires the soul both to scorn the vices of its villains and imitate the noble and virtuous actions of its heroes, philosophy, which is too grave and austere to bring delight, leaves the soul cold and indifferent. B. Poetry unites the universal truths, abstract precepts of philosophy with the concrete examples, physical acts of history. A. Such concrete universals, e.g., Aesop's fables, Jesus' parables, have the power to implant themselves in our memory and judgment. Though the historian is bound to recount a particular event just as it was, even if that event debases virtue and encourages vice, the poet is free to alter the particular so as to embody more fully the universal that is sought. Teen. As his supreme example, Sidney recounts the parable of the ewe lamb that Nathan the prophet used to convict David of his sin, 2 Samuel 12. Teen. Sidney next moves on to refute 4 arguments leveled against poetry. A. Poetry is unprofitable, there are many better ways to spend our time. A. Poetry is, in fact, the most fruitful of all knowledge. It has the power, through teaching and pleasing, to move its hearer to virtuous action. Though, as we just saw, it does so more effectively than philosophy or history. B. Poetry is the mother of lies. A. Poets never lie, for they never claim their poems to be the truth. Though poetry, like the stage, offers an illusion, an account of what should or should not be, not what is, only fools confuse illusions with reality. C. Poetry entices and leads to sinful behavior. A. It is the abuse of poetry, not poetry itself, that leads to sin. Though, if we are to accept this argument, then we must also criticize the Bible, which has often been perverted into a source for heresy and sin. D. Plato kicked the poets out of his republic. A. For Sidney, this argument is the hardest, for he honors Plato above all. Though, nevertheless, it was the poets who taught and guided the philosophers. Teen. As did Lominus, Sidney finds an anxiety of influence between Plato and Homer. After all, 7 cities strove for the honor of being Homer's birthplace, while the city of Athens voted to banish or kill Socrates. Char. Plato's central critique of the poets was their scandalous stories about the gods, but the poets did not invent them, they just imitated them. Punch. Indeed, as Saint Paul affirms in Acts 17, it was the pagan poets rather than the philosophers who came closest to foreseeing the truths of Christ. Paul quotes pagan poets 3 times in his writings. Che. Plato himself, in his Ion, affirms that poets speak via divine inspiration. Sat. In all these arguments, Sidney, like Lominus, turns Plato on his head. IV. Sidney concludes by putting a curse on all poet haters. May they never win love for want of a sonnet, may they be forgotten for want of an epitaph.